Rights of Nature, and Alberto on Ideological Foundations, according to Pikety, the economist. I'm going to be talking about beginnings of racism and how it has been used and how it has infected all of our culture and ourselves. In Quakers, Gladys and Dale and I wrote out just a little summary in order to encourage dialogue. That's what we're going to do now. So I'll read this. Anybody want to interrupt me? Just the six of us interrupt me and say, I just want to say something about that. When Lolly does hers, she says the same thing. If she gives some information about the rights of nature, she says also people can interrupt her. So what we're doing now is beginning a conversation. So I'm going to read what we wrote. And like I said, interrupt me, and then Lolly and Alberto will continue. The underground narrative in our culture and in ourselves. The normalized mindset of our culture has too often been the objectification of people, land, water, and air as economic resources. This cultural mindset in the past has justified slavery, harsh working conditions for children, the poisoning of our planet, and extinction of species 1,000 times the usual rate. The Civil War freed slaves, but was followed by black codes and Jim Crow laws. Courageous civil rights workers made demands and sacrifices that brought about civil rights reforms, like the Voting Rights Act and school integration. The Nixon administration countered these lofty victories with the Southern Strategy, a plan to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to racism against African Americans in order to sustain their ability to profit from dwindling resources. This political power is used to subsidize fossil fuels and enact policies that benefit the corporate interests that fund resistance to environmental conservation and legislation to slow climate change. Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013, and school integration is being threatened by the corporate support of charter schools. The cultural mindset of exploitation for the benefit of, quote, me and mine, has again and again gained a foothold in our consciousness. Now, 400 years later, we continue to objectify and exploit, and likewise to reap the harvest in the life-erasing consequences of our social and economic inequities and the burning crisis of climate change that is firing up to destroy all life on Earth. As a result of the powerful work by activist groups like Black Lives Matter, numerous organizations, coalitions, and legislators are addressing the systemic disparities that are the result of policy choices deliberately designed to deliver the inequitable outcomes in which we live today. Dismantling the big money opposition to their efforts is a massive undertaking. Surely we are all called upon to support in every way possible these heroic activists. Many of our forebears seem to understand, as we do now, that our own salvation depends on justice for all. The Smithsonian Magazine cites a Quaker meeting in 1738 in which Benjamin Lay proclaimed Quakers who fail to heed the prophet's call to respect all peoples equally must expect physical, moral, and spiritual death. He accompanied this statement by stabbing an animal bladder full of bright red pokeberry juice, spilling the blood on the Quakers who owned slaves. Emma Lazarus, 1849 to 1887, famous for the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." While it is necessary to acknowledge and respond to the devastating outcomes of exploitation, which we identify as an overriding concern with, quote, me and mine at the expense of another, We must also identify and understand the source of exploitation. Within our exploitative culture and economy, we continue this rampant theft with impunity. Why do I take from another? In order to answer, it is crucial to witness the pervasive unfolding of the quote, me and mine mindset close up on a personal level. On the surface in daily living, I may get a passing grade. The absence of Martin Buber's quote, I and thou goes unnoticed in our day-to-day activities. Me and mine quietly becomes I and it. Again, Buber's. I am challenged to see below the surface of myself with its manifest forms to the ingrained structures of thought that generate the invisible underground narrative that justifies me and mine. Generations of these same manifold layers of thought structures precede me. Unless seen, I will remain, as did they, passive in front of staggering consequences. I will also lose the possibility of living in awe of the diversity of creation. Diversity is not only essential to the health and resistance of every species, and resilience, sorry, this was not written right. Diversity is not only essential to the health and resilience of every species, but equally essential to the human community and a source for the profound joy of living in a moment of reality. We stand committed to fostering and expanding a more just, equitable, and inclusive region for all by purposefully addressing systemic racism in our community. We want to greet each living being and fellow human with a genuine appreciation for their lives.
Each of the topics that we want to address, that last sentence where you had racism, like for Alberto, it could be capitalism or corporatism. And for me, with nature, it could be, I personally would have to say neoliberal capitalism, but anthropomorphism would be what I could insert in there, because we have become the basis for comparison. We somehow think, each of us individually, that we're the only ones who have a big brain or can or count, you know, whether it's in nature or corporatism or society as a whole. Anybody else? We're hoping for all to participate.
We can just go.
I had a question.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I wasn't sure, did I hear the word, the phrase black codes shortly after the end of the Civil War?
Yes.
I wasn't sure what that was.
It was the same thing. It was a precursor to the Jim Crow laws that happened. They were codes that prevented any of the Africans being able to actually access the rights that they were given. Like loitering became a criminal offense. For standing on the street, you could be picked up because you were loitering and put in prison where you could be forced to work for free. So they were essentially put you back in the slave condition. And, you know, they were promised 40 acres and a mule. Well, you know what happened to that. I mean, they were promised that by, who was it, Sherman, or I've forgotten which general it was that came through and said, yes, we need to promise the people that because they need some way of making a living. But when Andrew Johnson got into the presidency, he withdrew that, and everybody, all those people who had been given 40 acres and a mule, they all lost their property.
Have you all heard about the Green Book? Excuse me, Jeff.
No, go ahead.
40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, apparently there was, I think it was called the Green Book. So if blacks were traveling from city to city, if they had a copy of the Green Book, they knew where it was safe to spend the night. I see Art recognizes that. Otherwise, you know, there could have been a town that had sundowner laws, which meant you had to be out if you were black. You had to be out of that city before the sun set.
There was a film about a black guy from the South, but he was living in the North, and I can't think of who he was, but he went to the South, and the movie had a lot to do with the Green Book because he was touring the South as a jazz musician. It was pretty well known nationally in the 50s or 60s. He was a top guy. I can't remember his name.
Actually, I think he was a classical musician, wasn't he? In the movie, seems like it was playing classical.
Maybe so, or maybe both.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was quite a pianist.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you're talking 19th century. Was that the movie and book even 12 Years a Slave? I think it is.
No.
No.
This was the movie was called The Green Book.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
okay, it was called the Green Book. Yeah, good film.
No, 12 Years a Slave. Did people see that? Because yeah, this musician who was freed and lived in the North was tricked into going to a state that was not free, and people who tricked him there, they tricked him there saying that he was being offered a gig, and they got him drunk and they sold him into slavery, and it showed what he went through as he was sold from master to master until he finally word got to people who supported him in the North and were able to rescue him. But it just really showed the conditions that people were subject to.
Shelley, you reminded me of this audiobook I listened to recently. It is titled Cast, and it was aired on one of the recent episodes of the Oprah Winfrey's program. And as you know, when she promotes a book, when she endorses a book, it becomes automatically a bestseller. And this one here talks about the origins of the slavery, and makes comparisons with some other cultures as well. But it is the premise that the author makes is that or the message I got, rather, not the premise that the author makes. It is, to me, the bottom line. She describes this caste system in different countries, different cultures, pretty much as what we describe or we would discuss in the US as racism, because she says you cannot necessarily call it racism, and yet it is different classes, and the separations between those classes are so strongly established that basically nobody wants to touch them, right, as a topic. And one of the examples she gives is that one in India, where even today the untouchables that they call, it is the lowest level of the multi-caste structure in that country as it exists. It's they call them untouchables because the upper caste would not dare to touch them. They were unable to gain any access to education, for example. They were pretty much tied to take on the worst jobs, cleaning toilets and disposing of garbage and that kind of things, and so It's a nice book if you wanted to dive a little more into this topic. I think it might be worth even buying it. I'm just thinking about it.
What you're saying is such a perfect example of the me and mine attitude attached to one's supposed status in a society. Like, this is me, I'm the Brahma, or I'm the white person, or I'm the wealthy person, or I'm the educated person, or this is who I am, and that gives me privilege over you. So that basic attitude that we all have in ourselves, and I look back in my past and it's so implicit. You know, like I grew up middle-class kid, working class kid, but in my society where I grew up, my family was respected and I was smart in school, and I just felt like, okay, you know, I'm good. So kids whose parents were migrant workers or whatever, I was nice to them, but I felt superior, right? Because you don't think about what you've been given, you just take it in. Oh, this is who I am, not what this society is and what different people were born into through no fault of their own. You know, there's this whole attitude of ourselves as community that we have to, in order to see the truth of the society that has developed in a way that's destroying all of us, we have to change this mindset.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that's been coming to me while Alberto and Shelley, you were talking, is the feeling that, you know, I mean, this is so old, you know, the mindset for casteism that it would be easy to say, well, it's just the way people are. But the thing I really feel is that, including climate change, situations have really kind of come to the point where we have to acknowledge the damage that we are doing to ourselves and everybody else by holding on to these castes, and the need to actually come to understand how to let go of those. It has become a global goal, you know, that I think figuring out how to be a human race together is now a priority for survival that I think that just a few years ago we could still pretend was not our problem.
It reminds me of the discussion about wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, and that we actually have a responsibility toward the other in our lives, not just ourselves. So I've never really understood those who feel like, I don't have to wear a mask, you know, have that arrogance or ignorance perhaps about not wearing a mask, because at the moment, most of us think that and social distancing or just staying home is the best way to protect ourselves and others from COVID.
What Shelley was talking about has a whole lot to do with history, and what all of this has a lot to do with is history. Americans are very flat as far as history is concerned. We really don't understand even our own history. We need the history to put it in context. This country was founded by white men, I guess through no fault of their own, but that's the way the history was. But now the white men, some of them think that they own the country because they started the country, and so they represent the country, and that's obviously 2 centuries out of date.
Maybe you should say stole the country instead of started the country.
Read Jill Lepore's excellent history of the United States. It's the best history of the U.S. I've ever seen. It's a 1-volume book published just recently, about 3 years ago. It's unusual in that it's a pretty complete 1-volume history of the United States, but it's a fairly long book.
And what was that name again?
It's called These Truths, and her name is Jill Lepore, Lepore. It's really beautifully written. It's quite poetic and soaring prose. And it's quite objective and extremely well referenced. I mean, she's a highly respected, I think, Harvard or Yale or something historian. And one point she makes, for instance, is during the revolutionary period, during that 20 years or so, we were really fighting two wars. One was with the British, but the other was against slavery. At least, what I'd say, the civilized people in this country or the North and some Southerners were fighting against slavery. And a lot of people in the revolutionary group that founded the country were, of course, slave owners. And the fight between the North and South was obvious in that 20-year period, the revolutionary period. And she points out poignantly that we were fighting two battles at that time. One was the we won slavery, lost that one. It's really a striking book.
You kind of broke up there. Could you say that again?
Okay.
Could you say that again?
A strong point about the revolutionary period was in her book was that we were fighting the people who were sincerely behind the revolution and also were concerned about slavery. And those concerned people about slavery were really a majority, but they were stopped by a minority, numerically a minority, but they wouldn't join the Union, and there couldn't have been a union without this compromise, the various compromises about slavery that were made during the revolutionary period. And the country was clearly divided into two groups at that time. I think it is still clearly divided into two groups at this time, and we really see, we saw that most strongly during the Civil War, but we still see it today. I think you can say the Biden supporters and the Trump supporters, almost. And that war goes on, and she points out that during the revolutionary period, there were two wars being fought. One was against the British, and we won that war, but the other was against slavery, and we lost that one. And that's been tearing us apart ever since.
Seems like another word we could almost use when we talk about slavery and some of our own ideas is colonialism. Yeah. It's the thought that it all belongs to me or right. Us.
It's also been called America's original sin.
I'm sure most of you are aware of this, that when the country first began, although we began it by disenfranchising and committing genocide against the Native Americans, which we can't forget, in order to cement the power of the elites, it was necessary to separate the white indentured servants from the black indentured servants, who at that time were not seen as not equal. And they found it after Bacon's Rebellion, and they saw that during Bacon's Rebellion, although it was actually, the forces of the white and the black indentured servants had combined in order to disenfranchise further the Native American, they had combined and were threatening the interests of the elite. And so then that's when they started this series of laws that created slaves, so white indentured servants remained white indentured servants and black became slaves. And because it was out of political interest in order to defeat or prevent their coalition that threatened elite power.
And this is how economic interests.
Economic interests, right. And that's what's going on today, where we're continuing this separation of creating scapegoats and creating others like whites who feel they can be superior and can identify as supreme, as white supremacists, and to keep the two forces against each other's throats so that the elite are not threatened.
Are you all familiar that the indigenous in North America had slaves they captured from other communities? Okay.
No, but they did.
So Europeans are not, coming here. We're not, the European base that many of us are not unique.
Except that the American form of it really was, the American form of slavery really was exceptionally harsh. And, do you remember the Nazis, considered using the American form of slavery when they were trying to figure out what to do about the Jews, and they decided the American system was too harsh, so they modified it.
Wow.
Made to laugh.
Hey,
Maybe we should. Maybe we should.
I don't know if you can see these. Oops.
What is
Pull it
it?
back
It's
a little bit. What is it? Slant it differently, Alberto. Slant it a little bit.
I can't read.
No,
it.
I can't-
Describe it for us.
what does it say?
Well, anyways, this is oh,
All right. What does
No
it say?
No one.
We can't
What?
read it.
it
Tell us what it
says,
says.
no one is illegal on stolen land.
Right.
I don't know. It was a protest a couple of years back, maybe 3 years ago, in downtown Fayetteville, and I went up there and I saw this girl holding this sign, and I thought, hey, I need to take a picture of that, and it says a lot.
Right.
It's a lot.
Maybe we should continue with Lolly's presentation now. That'll give us a little more fodder to base our
Right.
discussion.
You know, I was going to put
Lolly, you're breaking up. Give it a second.
I was going to put my bibliography up so you all could see it, but there's so few of us. Let me just leave it at this, that if you would like it, because I'm going to speak from it, just write me at lollytyndall@yahoo.com. And feel free to this. The title of the book
Lolly,
that I've
Lolly,
read.
hang on just a minute. It's the GoToMeeting is saying that if some of us could turn off our webcams, we can.
I'll turn off
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn
Okay.
mine off and see if that doesn't fix it. Somebody else is going to have to turn theirs off too.
Turn off the mic or the
I
camera?
will too. Where do you do that, Gladys?
At the bottom, there's
just hit camera.
4 buttons together, and one of them is camera, and you just click camera. Now, if you have not yet seen Lolly's PowerPoint or her screen, you're going to have to come back on long enough to see her screen. Oh, that helped a lot, Lolly. I can see you really well now. Okay, now get your presentation up and you can get the people.
I'm not going to put my bibliography on the screen. I'll only send it to anyone who wants it. It's not very big. And if you're interested in some of the notations, then write me at lollytyndall@yahoo.com. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
I can, but
Okay, good. So the book that I was basing a lot of my thoughts on is a book by, let's see, David Boyd. He's a lawyer, I think, an environmental lawyer, perhaps. And it's called simply The Rights of Nature. And in it, he does a lot of detail about different countries around the world who are coming around to the thought that nature has rights, and if we don't get it right, we're going to kill ourselves. You know, he doesn't say it quite that blatantly as I do. But for example, I'm going to read a paragraph or two that came from a description of his book, and then I'm going to give some examples as I read his book. Palila versus Hawaii, the Telawara Act, Sierra Club versus Disney. These legal phrases hardly sound like the main English, but beyond the headlines portending environmental catastrophes, movement of immense import has been building in courtrooms, legislatures, and communities across the globe. Cultures and laws are transforming to provide a powerful new approach to protecting the planet and the species with whom we share it. Lawyers from California to New York are fighting to gain legal rights for chimpanzees and killers. And lawmakers are ending the era of keeping these intelligent animals in captivity. and India, judges have recognized that endangered species, from birds to lions, have the legal right to exist. Around the world, more and more laws are being passed recognizing that ecosystems, rivers, forests, mountains, and more have legally enforceable rights. And if nature has rights, then humans have responsibilities. In The Rights of Nature, noted environmental lawyer David Boyd tells his story, which is, at its heart, one of humans as a species finally growing up. Read this book and your worldview will be altered forever. So here are three entrenched and related ideas. One, anthropocentrism. I meant to say that rather than anthropomorphism a few minutes ago. Anthropocentrism, which we know is humans being the center of it all. Two, economic growth. And then three, these are related and entrenched ideas, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and Plato, the Christians with their great chain of being back in the day, and the Genesis idea of dominion over. Amongst Christians, it wasn't until St. Francis came around that he said, we are equal. He advocated equality of all creatures. And I remember seeing, I don't know if the movie, it was a long time ago, Father, Son, Sister Moon. It was a title, very beguiling.
Oh, yeah.
Charming. Yeah. That they're all brothers and sisters. And it's our arrogance that we think we're the only species with rights. Some examples, the high seas have been treated as global commons for exploitation. But things change over time. Look at slavery that we were talking about, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, great apes and chimpanzees. Humans are as biologically dependent on the ecosystem as any other. We are part of nature. The legal revolution of the book is one, reduce harm suffered by sentient animals. Two, stop human-caused species extinction. Several years ago, I was the one who happened to give the book, The Sixth Great Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert.
Oh, yeah.
And three, protect the planet's life support system. So these are three of the basis for this book for a legal revolution. So there are people, legislatures, courts across the world beginning to acknowledge all of what has just been said. And there's a couple of examples that the book gives. One of the first ones, and many of these come from the indigenous, which I'm going to talk about too in just a minute. The Maori of New Zealand wanted their river, the Wanganui, to be not polluted. And then in Ecuador, Alberto Acosta worked with President Correa, I think it was in the 90s, to put it into legislation, into the nation's constitution. And what ended up for nature to have rights, they said, and this is the tricky part, and you can see why, that they said we can use the resource, because both Ecuador and Bolivia are very resource-rich countries. Mining is a big deal. We can use the resource, but listen to the catch, but not exploit the ecosystem. And so that's where the problems really came up. Bolivia, I've been following South America, having lived in Mexico and South America for a time as I was growing up. It's very important to me to follow it. Perhaps you know that Evo Morales he's indigenous, he was the president, and more than likely, because of a U.S. we'd call it a coup, he's now no longer the president, even though many say he was legally re-elected. So the book continues. It's interesting to read if you want to do that. There are many examples of animal intelligence. I watch the birds, just here at home, feeding the birds, and I watch them do things that let me know that. I want to move on to other items. You might want the bibliography for these other items. Simply put, the right of by David is an interesting read that shows what's happening legally and constitutionally around the world. But this is a movie. It called something. I didn't look at it. It was produced or directed, I can't remember which, by Mark Ruffalo. You probably know of him as being a fairly well-known actor. It's a rights of nature documentary from Invisible Hand. And what I found to be good about it is it has it had a list of so many different environmental organizations who are working. I'll give you a few names: Tribunal of the Rights of Nature, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, Earth Law Center, Indigenous Environmental Network, and more. Those are just some. Now, to go to a slightly different way, do you all remember the title or the name of an activity called the Enclosure Act?
Yeah.
In the 1500s in England, there was to be land enclosure where the farmer, let's just call it the peasant farmer, was going to lose access to the commons. David Bowyer is a great writer on the commons, and we have had common lands all over the world. And as an example of what's happening to what I would call our commons, our national parks, look who wants to exploit resource base right now in our national parks. At any rate, there was a fellow named Robert Kett in 1549 who led, imagine this, 16,000 English to resist the land enclosure. In other words, fencing in public grazing lands that had been known as the commons. Anyone could use them. Well, you know what happened to him. I'm sure you've guessed it. He was tried for treason and hung. And this was, to me, the interesting comment after this notion about the commons. The loss of the commons was the origin of jobs. Jobs where people work for other people's profit to survive. I'd never thought of that, you know. We pretend to be somewhat self-sufficient here on our farm because we create so much of our food. We have fish in the ponds and chickens for eggs and things like that. But people used to be literally self-sufficient. Okay, I'm moving on to yet another notion. And this is, it's a book called The Overstory by a novelist whose name is Richard Powers. And there's an interview with Richard Powers in Emergence magazine, Kinship, Community, and Consciousness, where he says that we have separated ourselves from the living world. Now, what his base is trees. And since I live out here on a mountaintop, Cave Mountain, and I live on the top, and we have 2 or 3 benches down that are part of our 53 acres, we're surrounded by trees. So we did cut some down to make a few small fields. So he uses trees from the great redwood forests of California and the West Coast to some of the few remaining hardwood old growth forest areas in the Appalachians, like in the Blue Ridge and the Smoky Mountains of the Carolinas. And he's astounded about what trees are and how they're the foundation of the forest and what they do. There's a book that Kent Bonner mentioned when he came to talk to us. He's the naturalist for the Newton County Wildlife Association. And he and I had read The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wallenbent. He still is an Austrian forester who takes care of some of the forests that at one time had been owned by noble families in Austria. And it describes how old trees become the base for new trees, or how aspen are all clones, and the root systems of the aspen may be 1,000 years old. But that little aspen tree that you're looking at right here may only have 10 years of growth on what's above the surface. So you begin to think, wow, we are all in it together. We are all part of a whole. So that's called, that book, that novel that he wrote is called The Overstory. And the Emergence magazine, if you're interested in nature, Emergence magazine would be something you'd probably want to go to see what else is there. He says, we have to escape the life of commodity and replace it with the life of community, and that it requires a conversion of consciousness. So this leads me to probably my favorite part, which is working with the indigenous. And the person that you may be familiar with, Robin Wall Kimmerer, is a Potawatomi Indian botanist, biologist who teaches at SUNY in upstate New York. And she wrote a book that Jeannie Neath reviewed for us in our climate change forum called Braiding Sweetgrass. And it brought us right into the notion of, yep, we're all in it together. The podcast that I listened to most recently by Kimmerer is called The Intelligence of Plants. And what drew me into this, gosh, it must have been 40 or 50 years ago, there was a book called The Secret Life of Plants, a little bit like The Hidden Life of Trees and The Intelligence of Plants and so forth. And that's when I also started reading about Findhorn. And because I'd studied a lot of cultural anthropology and have been so happy with the opportunity to work with indigenous groups in New Mexico, I work with the Pueblos really closely. And a couple of years ago, a tornado came through our place and took down our old barn. It was on our wish list. We were going to take it down and build a new one. But since the tornado took it down, our insurance company paid for it. Well, I told one of my friends at Tesuque Pueblo, he's an elder, his name is Louis Kina. I said, Louis, that tornado came and took it down. And Louis said, Earth Mom knew, because the insurance company paid for it. So, and we didn't have to do the work of taking it down. And a bunch of friends came together on a work day to help us clean it all up. And then the insurance company brought in a team and built us a brand new spectacular barn. So one of the things amongst the indigenous, and this may be difficult for a hardcore scientist to resonate with, is that they will feel that there is a spirit in everything. There's a spirit in the tree. There's a spirit in the soil. And I like to compare it to, we're all carbon particles from the Big Bang. At any rate, that gives you a lot of ideas to go from if you're interested. And it's the indigenous point of view that I particularly care for. Just the other day, I finally got in touch with one of my Pueblo friends at Taos Pueblo. I'd been trying to call her to make sure she's doing okay with COVID. And I had talked to her several months ago, and I wanted to make sure she was still okay. And she said, yep, they've been trying to get in their corn crop and their squash, which that's dear to my heart because they're farmers. They've been farmers for centuries. And that was one of the big interests Norm and I had, was to grow our own food. So I've been doing the same thing she has. And one of her sons is going through traditional ceremonials in the Kiva, doing special Kiva ceremonies. So at any rate, thank you so much. I'll stop talking. Anybody want to make any comment? I'd like to see your faces again if we could do it and still be able to hear each other.
Let's try it and just see if it'll work.
There you go.
Thank you. That
Can you hear me?
was amazing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Dick. Yeah.
Before we do this, how did we get Lolly's full face? I never could get her on my screen, except the small picture.
up
Could
there
I
in the very
have
center,
Lolly the full screen?
up in the center
Well,
of the screen, Dick,
I,
there's something
I think I
that
punched
says to
everything.
everyone, maybe. It says, anyway, it's the view button, and
Oh, Robin says view everyone, and I didn't think that would reach me. Reach
then
Lolly, I mean.
if you wanted to see only Lolly, you hit who's talking.
Where is that?
It's in the
Who's
same
talking?
button, the view button at the top
View
of the,
everyone. Yeah.
and so who's talking?
Well, I'll click on that.
Yeah, but she's done now. So
Oh,
now now you
oh,
want to see all of us.
got it.
Yeah.
Understand. All right.
As Lolly was talking, I was remembering when the city council was trying to pass stream protections, and the protect the riparian areas of the stream. And I'm very allied with this because we live on Clear Creek. I'm very concerned about how clean that creek is, and people were comparing it to, or people were coming up against it because they felt that it threatened their own rights. So it's me and mine against the nature's rights, which actually nature's rights are the rights of everybody together, and not just what I can use for my. I think the innovation of owning personal property was what the beginning of that. Like you were talking about the commons. Was really the beginning of that sense of me and mine, instead of myself as part of a community and part of nature.
Human beings are not nature. Imagining that we're not, that's not us anymore. Oh,
We're part of nature, though.
yeah, yeah.
That's what we need to figure out.
Lolly,
We need to see that.
Mhm.
Lolly, I wish that we had time for you to share more about your experience with the people of the Pueblos, because it sounds like you've had a long, rich relationship there. And I've had a somewhat of a relationship with different wisdom keepers, indigenous people. And it's been interesting to find out that there are some of them, like Kimmerer, who are also scientists, and who keep that wisdom. There's a group called the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals that in mid-September did a whole indigenous climate conference with Winona LaDuke as the key speaker. And the International Indian Treaty Council offers weekly Zooms with great indigenous leaders from both the northern and southern hemispheres, and they often talk about both COVID and environmental issues. So I'm just finding out about this particular interface from my friend Kenneth Cohen, who's the white person that I know that's been the closest to Native Americans and other indigenous teachers. And we're hoping to work with some of these scientist wisdom keepers in talking more about climate change, particular questions that some of our scientists that we're working with, that I'm working with have. So I think increasing the dialogue in that area is great. And you've done more than that. You've actually lived it. So I want to appreciate that. Oh.
Go ahead.
An idea that's always appealed to me has to do with education and history again, is that the courses on college campuses, for instance, all of the big history courses like Western civilization, and probably in high schools also, should at least go back 6 million years. They shouldn't just start with so-called civilization. In other words, the agricultural revolution about 10 or 12, about 12,000 years ago. They should go back at least to the origin of humans, two-footed creatures. That goes back about 6 million years. And I think we get a much bigger sense of how we fit into the rest of the animal kingdom, because we're animals. And that's a good thing. And we should revel and love that idea. The consciousness surely of the mammals, all the other mammals, surely is equal to our consciousness. They just don't have the rationality that we have. They can't reason because they don't have the frontal lobes of the brain, but I think they feel and experience and sense things just as well as we do, whether it's an elephant or a dog or maybe even birds. Birds seem to be very intelligent, at least, surprisingly so. We could get a much bigger perspective on all this stuff if we just open our eyes to a bigger history. And I think that educators could really do that for us.
I think in a good part, we need to start by educating the educators, Art. Some portions of the population, including our own educators, are unfortunately highly embedded in religious beliefs that kept them from accepting that the history of our planet goes beyond just a few thousands of years, right?
Yeah. Relates to global warming too. Sometimes when I give a talk about global warming, I will refer to the history of the ice that goes back 800,000 years or so. And then I'm forced to remember that my audience, if I'm talking to the Rotary Club someplace in Northwest Arkansas, you know, they don't understand that the history of the planet goes back hundreds of thousands and millions of years, and they don't accept that. No, I think we started 10,000 years ago.
Really are.
Broaden our
Still
horizon.
today.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go before we're at the point where people are really listening to each other. And that's probably one of the things that I think is important about the dialogue process you introduced, Shelley, is because I think that those of us who are listening to each other's stories need to be figuring out how to open up further to more stories, because I think we got to figure out how to include the stories of conservative people in our body of stories so we understand where they're coming from about some of these things. We have this long history of not hearing those stories at all, and we've got to start including that in our story bank. Because we got to figure out how to be inclusive at that point of view, if there's any hope of, you know, connecting them to whatever we're thinking. It just, we're not doing that right. It's just not working so far.
Right. Read a good book by, I think her name is Hochfelder. I know the title of the book. It's called Strangers in.
Yeah, I have Strangers in
Strangers
Our Own Land. Yeah.
Really a fine sociological study of people in Louisiana, and they're good people, but they're awfully narrow to their own detriment, and they vote for people that just lead them down the daisy trail and off center.
Don't you think it comes back to that me
Right.
and mine again? And that.
It's like Shelley was.
Go ahead. Who's talking? We can't hear you, Jeff. Jeff, we can't
It
hear
was
you.
like you were sharing with us, not only about. Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a
Well,
huge gap
I
there.
don't know what to do. Carry on.
We
Jeff,
can't hear you, Jeff. There's just a long lag.
I see.
Turn off your computer, Jeff.
Perhaps somebody else should.
Oh,
Turn off your video. We can probably hear you.
there we go. Now try it.
How's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Much better.
I was feeling like re-emphasizing something that you were pointing at, Shelley, and what you were sharing about how policymakers have polluted the minds of people and acculturated them in different ways that maybe have really been much more than people's sort of natural tendency to objectify or separate from other people. They've been further separated by policymakers. And I guess I'm more aware of that just from reading Stamped from the Beginning.
Mhm.
This book that actually mentions three different groups. They're the abolitionists, the segregationists, and and the anti-racists, which is a different topic, but I just wanted to comment to that because Art was talking about two essential groups, and this is a little bit more nuanced maybe.
Hello, Arlene. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, sorry to be late, and I haven't dressed or anything today, so all of a sudden I just thought I better get here. Hi, Lolly. Hi, everyone. I'm reorganizing my files, as you can see behind me, so.
On the issue of other animals being very similar to us and equal to us in many ways, Franz de Waal has written a nice book called Mama's Last Hug. It's about chimpanzees.
Yeah.
And these are amazing creatures. They have a total social structure that they really understand, and they're quite subtle in their social dealings. Quite subtle, at least as subtle as humans are in their social dealings. It's an amazing book. Mama's Last Hug.
I'm wondering if maybe we need to get on to Alberto's report so we have time to talk about that also. Alberto, do you want to go?
Sure, Gladys. I have some slides to share, but I think I need to be granted
Okay.
that.
Oh, so yeah.
Okay.
So we
Okay,
need to.
Alberto, you are the. Wait, 1 second. Okay, you are the presenter now. Let us see your screen, your face, and then some of us can shut off our video. Arlene, we're having some video problems, so we're trying to keep the videos off as much as we can.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, Alberto, can you get it? All right, that looks hopeful. Can everybody see Alberto's screen?
Good,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Capital and ideology.
I noticed his mic is off, or at least it seems to be.
Oh, yeah, you're muted, Alberto. Yeah, thank you.
There you go. So this is the book. I was referring to you all some couple of sessions back. It is a fairly new book by this author, Thomas Pikety, and he's a French economist, very well known now around, and he came up with this second title on the subject of capital. The first one was published in 2014, just capital, and then he came up with this capital and ideology, where he really does go through history and explains his view, anyways, of how the capitalist system links to the different ideologies, and how through history he basically says that in his view is somewhat similar, but with maybe just slight differences, but the foundation is pretty much the same. These are just the contents of the book, and I picked a few graphs to show you all what are the subjects that he discusses in his book at length. By the way, this is a big book, a little over 1,000 pages in total. So some of the things he shows, like in this graph, or discusses health and education in the world, where he's just trying to see how the world has progressed over time, and in this case, showing it by educational levels and life expectancy and literacy rate. As you can see, from as far back as the early 1800s to today, literacy rate has increased substantially. And again, that's a way to show that the world has progressed, and then including in aspects such as income. And this is showing in euros. He uses euros, but keeping track of the different times, he made some calculations in today's euros from as far back as the 1700s, and how the average income per month has changed. And as you can see, it really started to grow back in about early 1800s, along with the world population. As a context, the world human population reached 1 billion inhabitants right about the year 1800, so it would be right about here. Just to give some context in there. But then one of the main premises in his book is inequality, and his premise about that concept is that it has existed for as long as the civilization, at least in the new era, has done so, and he shows in different ways with different multiple graphs that view. And in this case, he's showing the share of the top decile of the population. That was the top 10 richest percent of the population by country, and how much of that income within the country, the national income, that top decile earns. And as you can see, from as far back as the 1980s, that has been low, and then that top decile has been increasing its share of the national income. The US is this line here in blue, and so it means in this context that the top 10% of the population in the US, the richest 10%, is accumulating nearly 50% of the national income. I mean, this is not new to any of you. This is a different way he addresses these aspects related to inequality in different regions in the world. And this is something common, right? Even China, which is, as we know, a socialist country, the inequality is growing. Europe is just a little behind, but it is growing. And then some other countries, Brazil, India, the Middle East, and again the US as perhaps one of our main points of attention. This is what they describe as the elephant curve. A little more complicated, at least to me, to describe in just a brief moments. But the point I want to make here is that, as it expresses, the bottom 50% of the population captured only about 12% of total growth, when the top 1% captured about 27% of the total growth. This is a global perspective. So it tells how big of a discrepancy there is between the top richest portions of our population, only down to that 10%, versus the bottom 50% of the population earning the lowest salaries. And so it is big. This is another example where he addresses the regions Europe, US, and Japan. Over time, from the year 1900 to about today, and how that has changed. And the point he makes here is that right about World War II and immediately after, the world faced these crises in the economy globally, and that caused a great degree of redistribution of wealth, and that came to reflect as a decrease in the inequality levels, and then that was maintained all the way to right about 1980, when President Reagan started in there, and then the trickle-down economics and all that kind of things, along with some setbacks on environmental laws that had also been adopted back in the 70s, bringing a little bit of context also around ecology. Then we started to see an increase in inequality, not only in the US, but also in some other countries, if anything, just at certainly different degrees. He also addresses at length aspects related to taxes, and one of the things that he makes emphasis on is the fact that there is, back in the early mid 1900s, a huge increase in tax rates to up to about 90%, and so that he attributes part of that as a reason to argue for this reduction in inequalities, and keep in mind also that back in the 80s, when the Reagan administration started and the trickle-down economics, cutting taxes was one of his main topics, and the way he was selling his presidency, it must resonate today with so much discussion about just trickle-down economics. Very similar. This is another interesting graph that shows some of the arguments he makes about inequalities is related to education, and he shows this graph that to me says it all, and that is the income, the family income versus access to university, and as you can see here, it is the real values, the dotted line here in red, is almost right along that straight line, depicting pretty much the story that the higher the family income, the higher the chances for kids in that family to access university level education, whereas at the bottom side of income levels, the chances for those kids to reach a higher education are very, very slim. And he shows, and again he provides some examples of some different structures of society, and this is just one of them. He he shows France back in 1910, Algeria 1930, and Haiti in 1780. And you see here on these graphs showing the share of total national income by the top 10%, the next 40% of the population, and the bottom 50% of the population. As you can see here, that top 10%, the just top 10% of the population, almost regardless of where we look at, is always fairly high. And he makes some very interesting notes about Haiti being a former French colony, and some of the things that I did not know, for example, is that there were some payments, retributions to the slave owners, which is also something that happened here in the United States with the slavery, the emancipation of slavery. But he describes the situation in Haiti because it is even a little more extreme, to the point that those retributions paid to slave owners back in the days, and in order to also leave the colonies alone, they came up with some agreements that in today's economy would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars worth for a country such as Haiti, which is very small, relatively small population. And so they got into an enormous debt that apparently had to continue pay France even to mid to late 1900s. So it was a long time with a huge debt implied in there. It's just, again, an example of how fascinating I found this book. Again, another graph showing the share of the top decile in total national income, how it changed over time, but now in more recent times it is coming back, increasing again since about the 1980s. Wealth is another concept that he also addresses a lot in his book. For those of you that, well, I'll explain this to myself. I'm not very savvy when it comes to economic terms, and whenever I heard income inequality or wealth inequality, I couldn't tell whether those were different things, but they are apparently. And so when he talks about wealth, he explains this at length. He speaks about everything that's accounted for in economic terms within a country, and it is a very similar story. This is not just income as salaries and rents and things that give the individual some capital back, and so when talking about wealth, they are including all property. And so when they look at this, the situation about inequality is even worse, as you can see here. When we talk about wealth, the top richest 10% of the population by country owns or owned back in the 1900 upwards of 80%, all the way up to nearly 95%. And nowadays, look where the U.S. is located. It is nearly 75%. That is the percentage of the national wealth owned by the top richest 10% of the country. And again, perhaps this doesn't surprise anybody, Art, you going to say something? No? I'll continue. And again, another illustration here, the bottom 50% of the population and how much they share of the total income has declined, again, right about the year 1980, whereas that of the top 1% has just increased. Going to go ahead. This is one of the last things that he addresses in his book. He's not only going through history and how, in his view, this is so ingrained in all sorts of societies by centuries of history, in getting this inequality and allowing the richest to become richer at expense of the rest of the population, pretty much. And so his proposal is to do something like this. He describes it as the transnational democracy, and basically through national and transnational assemblies, where the groups that represent or supposedly represent the population are truly representatives of the different sectors of that population, even to the point that they say the board of directors, for example, for large corporations, they should have, and they also give, in fact, some examples how in some countries in Europe, Germany is one of them, one of those that comes to mind. The board of directors of large corporations dedicate by obligation anywhere between 30% and all the way up to 50% of the employees of that corporation. And that's his argument says will bring an immediate representation of those interests by those other sectors, rather than allowing the board of directors to be just looking for an only interest of the shareholders of that company. In other words, increasing just the profits for those investors and for that company, rather than keeping also in mind the interests and viewpoints of the employees who make up whether that corporation would be successful or not by means of the work output that they are bringing together. And so I'll shift now to something else within the book, something that I really liked as well, which is a small section towards the very end of the book where he addresses carbon emissions, and I'll read just this one paragraph, and then I will stop so that we can have a little more discussion. He says, I quote, "The inequality reduction measures discussed earlier, including a sharp increase in the progressivity of taxes on high incomes and large fortunes, are therefore a necessary condition for combating climate change. They are not a sufficient condition, however. Among the other tools that have been widely discussed is a tax on carbon emissions. Several conditions have to be met, however, for such a solution to become viable. First, The carbon tax must not be seen as the only approach to dealing with the problem. Often, the most effective way to reduce emissions is to establish norms, prohibit certain practices, and agree on strict standards for automobile emissions, heating equipment, building insulation, and so on. In many cases, these are more effective choices than just placing a high tax on carbon. Second, no carbon tax will be fully accepted and effective unless all of the revenue it generates is used to compensate lower and middle class households affected by the tax and to pay for the transition to renewable sources of energy. The most natural way to do this would be to integrate the carbon tax into the progressive income tax as he proposes in some previous sections. With each increase in the carbon tax, one has to calculate the average impact on people at different income levels as a function of the structure of average expenditures. One can then automatically adjust the income tax schedule and basic income transfer system to neutralize the effect. One of the things that he makes emphasis on, and this probably comes back to one of Shelley's early comments today, is that he says we need to be conscious about all these and be willing to establish lifestyle changes. But he says the magnitude of the lifestyle changes required to cope with the climate crisis is so great that it is hard to imagine how to make those changes socially and politically acceptable without establishing stringent and verifiable norms of justice. In other words, it is hard to see why the lower and middle classes in the rich countries would be willing to make a major effort to curtail emissions if they feel that the upper class is free to go on living and emitting greenhouse gases as before. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you about this book, without getting too lengthy and bore you to death.
Alberto, so
Yes.
I did not get the name of the book down. So what was the name of it again?
The name is Capital and Ideology.
Okay.
Alberto, I noticed that one of the data points was that in 1980 is when the upper 10% started getting more and more and more money. Ronald Reagan, and I'll represent Malcolm here for just a moment since he's not here, how much he dislikes the Republicans. So, not to be too political here. Forgive me.
Right. No, hey, we touched a little bit on education before. Gee, it just makes me wonder what the impact in our societies, and this is, and I'm not just talking about the U.S. I wonder what the impact of something like this, some knowledge like this, would be in the world in general by getting these ideas just, and not as a dogma, but just rather something to discuss, something to bring up and for students to discuss. I think that is, I don't know, if I were a teacher or a professor, I would use a book like this in one of my classes to get students to have a discussion and see what kind of conclusions they come up with.
What was so apparent to me was in the graphs between all the different countries, the shifts in economy were affecting everyone the same, right? So we're really dealing with a global economy and a global 10%. So we pretend that we are dealing with these different countries having these different economic conditions, but really the global 10% is riding some kind of process that's benefiting them at the negative consequences for the rest of us.
Right. One of the things that was not present here, and I haven't mentioned, but he comes back to many times throughout the book, is that situation about globalization and how capital gets moved around in order to avoid taxes, right? Avoid taxation. And he I don't know if he coined this term originally, but he uses it a lot, and he refers to this as the whole situation becoming eventually a race to the bottom, because what many countries, particularly relatively small countries, are doing in order to capture some capital is to lower taxes or even allow corporations to move capital or individuals to move capital entirely tax-free to their national coffins, right? The national financial institutions, in order to get that country to bring in some capital that in theory can be used to stimulate their local economy, when in reality that what that is doing most of the times is simply evading the paying of taxes elsewhere, and not being used to create wealth for the population. It certainly can create, or it does create wealth, but mostly and primarily to the owner of that capital. But to me, the concept that stuck with me was that race to the bottom, as he calls it, because these countries are getting into some sort of a race because they are trying to outdo each other in order to capture more capital to come into their own economy. But in doing so, they are not gaining anything really, and so the rich start getting more benefits by having to pay less taxes, and just becoming richer and richer. And with that the entire global wealth concentrating more and more in just a smaller group of individuals.
And I was thinking also about ideological foundations, how inequality is a basic ideological foundation that's accepted, that you can be part of the 1% and that's okay, and not recognizing the deleterious effect it has on the environment and everything else.
Right. So he says, I'm sorry, Art, let me make this quick comment. He addresses in an earlier part of the book those different societal structures. He refers in general as tripartite societies, in which it is the clergy, the nobles, and then the workers or laborers, and where the bulk of the wealth, up to nearly 90% of the wealth of a country or a society, was found and in just these first two groups, the clergy and the nobility. And believe it or not, throughout history, and he goes back to about 1500 and on, and throughout history, one of the features that these two societal groups share is that in terms of the proportion of the population, they both have or share only single digits, anywhere from as low as just shy of 1% to maybe about 5%. And then when you combine them both, they are still within the 10% of the total population. It is very, very interesting. I mean, the guy for an economist really impressed me with all the historic acumen that he put into this book. Sorry, Art, go ahead.
Archer, you're muted. You want to unmute?
Sorry. So one detail that I disagreed with him on was he suggested taking the proceeds from a carbon fee and dividend and without the dividend, and putting the proceeds into including the proceeds as just income to the government and reduce the taxes that way. In other words, combine it with the tax system rather than sending a proceeds check to a family, say monthly. And I really disagree with that, because you're gonna get major support for a carbon fee and dividend through the dividend. That's the way you get the thing supported politically. For one thing, when these families of four get a check every month or so with a few $1,000s in it from a meaningful fee on carbon, they're going to say, okay, I don't mind paying a little more for gasoline. And that's all right. I just got $4,000 for my family here. And they'll see that they're coming out way ahead. It's the carbon fee and dividends is going to have the effect of leveling incomes just the way we all would like it to happen. And I noticed that the United States is usually the country that's the biggest offender in inequality in most of those graphs. In some cases, the other Sweden and one of them, Sweden and Germany and some other country, were down at the bottom in inequality, and we still we're a standout way up at the top.
Right.
We hadn't learned much from the history, from the prior history. So we really ought to shape up on the income inequality score in this country. And one way to do that is with the carbon fee and dividend. But the dividends got to go back directly to families. Don't just put it include it automatically in income taxes or something.
I would like some clarification about that, because it didn't sound to me, he did say about including it in a progressive income tax, but we didn't get, Alberto didn't define exactly what a progressive income tax would be, but it did sound like he was accounting for the tax meeting the needs of the low income community along with developing renewable sources. Didn't he say something like that, Alberto?
Right. He is not. He does not get too much into detail about this particular topic, but throughout the book, he pretty much supports strongly that different level of taxation, progressive taxation, in which just as Ocasio-Cortez has been saying all along, that those individuals with very, very high levels of income, they could and should pay a much higher level. And so I believe what he means in that paragraph about that progressive tax is along the lines of, hey, for those individuals with a much higher level of income, that say top 10% bracket, they could pay a higher carbon tax. I believe that's what he means by it.
Okay.
That doesn't fit with.
I think it goes still along the lines of what we are discussing, and but perhaps going just a little extra step on that.
Under carbon fee and dividend, there's not exactly a carbon tax for the whole country because it's paid at the mine mouth or the well. It's paid at the source. And so just the oil companies and the coal companies and the gas companies pay the fee. That's part of why it's called a fee, I guess. But then everybody pays for it eventually because the price of all carbon fuels goes up, but the price of everything else, of the other fuels, stays the same. So you're really supporting renewables and nuclear. Anything that's not a carbon fuel is going to get support out of this. I'd be opposed to recycling that fee in the form of helping renewables or nuclear or any other form of energy production. Give it back to the people directly so that it's got political support. And this helps equalize incomes at the same time.
But I agree with Pikety's view actually more than CCL's, because CCL is trying to influence conservatives to vote for the measure, and so they would return the dividend equally to every citizen, which really is not equitable, since there are communities, frontline and fence line, low income, marginalized communities, which are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. And so they should actually be receiving more of the dividend back than someone in the 1% who would be receiving a dividend just like everybody else. And Pikety is basing it on the establishment of a progressive income to begin with, which tends to equal things out, make things a little more equitable.
The fee coming back equally to all families is going to automatically help equalize incomes. And if you don't give it back to as much to the upper 10% as you do to the lower 90% or something, you're going to lose some of your political support. I really want to solve global warming. I mean, I think that's just imperative. That should be a given for all of us. And we're not going to solve it unless we get politics behind it.
I agree with you, Art, but I don't agree that it's equitable.
It's almost 20 after, and I wonder what we need to do to close up and just make sure we remember where we are.
I would like to ask one question. You go ahead, Arlen. You haven't
I just
spoken.
want to say thank you so much for including me. This is very interesting, and I've got one of Pikety's books. It's really heavy reading, and the most recent one is very, very important. So thank you for summarizing that in a very clear and helpful way. What I've done is I've posted in the chat box a link to a little video that was put together by Naomi Klein, and she was interviewed yesterday, I think it is, by radio. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so this is a cute little video that kind of offers a vision that would restore equitability economically, and also looking at environmental issues. Lolly, hi.
Arlene, is that the animated one that's about 8 minutes long?
Yeah, it's real.
I sent it out too, but the link didn't work. Gladys, I think you got it.
I got it.
Yeah.
Did you get it, Art? Okay.
I got it, Holly.
It was really meaningful. Yeah, I liked it a bunch. Yeah.
You might notice that her husband was one of the writers and editors on it too, so she's got a team going.
From the ground up with our own hands. The first seeds were planted way back in the terror and tenderness of the pandemic. And then change.
I think I turned
I'm
it
sorry,
on when I was copying it.
I clicked on the link and I got it started.
Shelley.
I would just like, since the title of this forum was Ideological Foundations, I would just like Alberto to continue with that just a little bit on what ideological foundations he sees that Pikety is talking about that our capitalistic system is based on.
Well, I think it is in general. He doesn't say it this way, but it is in simple terms. um, the way when he addresses in a part of the book the aspect of representation, right? He does touch a little bit on that concept that you mentioned early on as well about the commons. I think he addresses the tragedy of the commons is the way he addresses it, and in the sense that throughout history, those in power have manipulated the system in a way to keep their votes with a higher weight than the rest of the society, and that way keeping their main interest afloat. And somehow this has, particularly when we look at the U.S., this has translated into the slogans about the land of the opportunities, that if you work hard, you will get ahead, and that kind of situations. When if we look back at some of those graphs about income inequality and those things, when we see the top 10% income going up almost fairly steadily, particularly going back to those 1980s, whereas the income for, say, the bottom 50% looks rather stagnant, almost to today. And so the conclusion, I don't remember how he describes it, but to me that translated into they have really got our society to drink that Kool-Aid, as the common phrase goes, because I see and I hear a lot of people definitely within that bottom 50% of the population in the country speak about and in favor of the capitalistic system as it exists today, and primarily in the United States, where it is very, very clear that extreme difference in income distribution and wealth distribution, and it is so hard to believe when we see that information that to me looks fairly solid, and then on the other hand, the reality on the streets say people don't see that, and so we can be more complicated and say, hey, this is a long issue related to education, the educational system, the political system, how things are done, the structure of that political system, how we elect our representatives, and how those representatives make decisions that impact back our society, but not by keeping in mind that interest by the majority of the population, but rather those that are sponsoring heavily their political campaigns when running for election and re-election. And then in a very simplistic way, just that phrase of our society still today keeps drinking that Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
We should remember that.
Go ahead, Art.
We should remember that back under President Eisenhower, I believe the top bracket was taxed at 90%. I think that's correct. My memory might fail me, but that's roughly correct. The problem is that money just automatically makes money, and people with money can buy senators. And so they've got two very strong and easy levers to to run this country and just run it for themselves. So you need a high tax on the richest, and we're just not willing to do that these days. I think it ought to be 90% at least on the upper 5% or so.
Arlene, did you have your hand up?
Go ahead,
I wanted
Arlene.
to just follow up to a couple of points that Alberto raised. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Number one, Alberto, you used the term tragedy of the commons, which actually has been fully debunked. And that was debunked by Eleanor Ostrom, and she got the Nobel Prize for her work. And essentially, she looked at how traditional communities manage their shared pool of resources. And in fact, it works out that that is indeed the best way to handle environmental resources, food supply, and so on and so forth. So David Bollier, who's with the Schumacher Center, turned that around and he said, it's really not the tragedy of the commons. The real issue is the tragedy of the markets and how they've been manipulated to unfair advantage by certain parties. And in fact, the movement now around that idea sometimes is referred to as the New Commons movement. And I have tons of resources on that if you're interested. But essentially, that's one way of looking at the commonwealth that is shared in an equitable way and managed fairly and sustainably. The second point I wanted to get to was this issue about income. Now, I took 3 college-level accounting courses, and I'm so proud to say I got A's in them. So here's what I'm going to share with you, the little bit I know about this. If you look at what I was told is called a 3-tier income statement, the top tier are assets like land, like property, like means of production. And if you own those property assets, then you benefit in multiple ways, one of which is the appreciation of those assets, point 1. The benefit that accrues to those assets because of public investments. So let's say, for example, you own a piece of land and then the public puts in a metro line right next to your piece of land. You capture all the added value from that public investment. And then the third way that those assets get value is from cash flow. And the fact of the matter is that most assets of that quality are owned by the top 1%. Then the second tier in the 3-tier income statement formula, which is just one of many, but it's a basic one, is interest and other kinds of revenue that come from investments. A bank account interest would be an example. Stock dividends would be a second example. So those are both forms of, both the first tier and the second tier are forms of passive income. If you own that stuff, you don't have to do anything. That's all passive income. Normal people, what used to be called middle-class people, their main asset was their home. Or their car, which is depreciated and really isn't a durable asset. But these days, most people, the majority of the people, I don't know the number, but it's maybe in the order of at least 60 or 70%, are in the bottom third on that 3-tier income statement. And they live based on their salary. So they don't have any passive income. They only have direct income from their labor, or maybe some small savings, relatively small savings that they can accrue, and therefore they get dividends. So that's part of the problem here, is that the assets have been gathered up by the 1%, and then they privatize public investments, which further benefit their assets. So I hope that's helpful to you.
Certainly.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
That makes me feel like, Arlene, we need to know more about that, and I wonder if you could do a whole presentation for us on it.
Hang on.
Come back. In fact, Gladys, thank you for that, because I wanted to make sure we brought that topic up before we leave. We don't have a presenter for November. And so the steering committee may need to get together, or if Arlene might be so gracious as to follow up November, first Sunday in November. She's my friend, by the way. She's smart.
You know, we're all smart. Boy, did I step into that.
You did. I love it.
Well, okay, so
Go ahead.
I love this stuff. See all these files behind me?
Yeah. Now we know what they're full of.
I beg your pardon?
Now we know what they're full of.
Yeah, well, I'm actually tossing a lot of files. I'm weeding everything right now. I'm throwing out 40 years of files. It feels so scary, but so good. So, but the short answer is yes. What I could do, I do have some PowerPoints that I put together and some other issues, but I can at least put together an email with some links, and then maybe we could do a share screen, and then I could click through these various links to show you some of these resources.
I would like to add to this, just a second, Art, real quick. Let me do one of these little organizational deals. Shelley, I really liked the three of us presenting, so the weight of the presentation was not on a single person's shoulders. And we all, did our forte and whatever, so that was really nice. So let's put that in our thoughts of having more than one presenter maybe on a topic, like you had unified the topic with your presentation for the Quakers a couple of weeks ago. So Arlene, if you put something together, maybe someone else like Dick or Jeff or Art or
Or maybe she
someone.
has enough material she could take up the whole period too. What do
Yeah,
you think, Arlene?
yeah.
I can talk, trust me.
Arlene, if you send what you've got to me, then I can disseminate it. Art?
Arlene, I was interested in your mention of the Schumacher Center. That's got to be named after the great economist.
It
E.F.
is, and you must go to their website. It's an assignment.
It's okay. I will. I will do that. He wrote one of my favorite books of all time. Small is beautiful. Economics as if people mattered.
Right.
I love the subtitle and the title.
So the general idea is relocalizing the economy and getting the Commonwealth and the assets back into the community. Simple thing like community land trust, so we get Wall Street investors out of our communities. I live in Santa Monica, and we are a case study for an economic disaster.
Do you follow Amory Lovins very much? I think he's quite in with that.
And I'm curious if the Schumacher work includes anything about worker-directed cooperatives.
Yes, yes.
I'm especially interested in that as a shift away from a heavily capitalist economy, and I'd like to hear what you have to think about that.
Are you addressing that question to me?
Yeah, I was.
Whatever you say, I agree with you.
Yeah, okay. All right, we just remember topic.
Another comment. Another comment. But before we wrap it up, I just learned that Sir David Attenborough, the naturalist, he has put a new book out. It's titled "A Life on Our Planet," and that there is also a program, I don't know, movie length kind of thing, with that same title that should be coming up on Netflix or Prime or something like that, one of those platforms. I believe sometime this coming week.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Somebody else had their hand up. Art, was that you? Oh no, Shelley.
I just wanted to pull the strings together before we closed, and that is we began with racism and the connection of racism and climate change, and we took it to the rights of nature, and then we took it to Pikety and what was happening with capitalism. And I would just like to say that one of the ideological foundations that we're all familiar with is that we can continue to survive with this level of growth. I think it's very clear to all of us that this is not possible, that capitalism has destroyed our economy, and environmental groups in responding to the devastation of our ecology, environmental groups in responding to the devastation of ecology for years just dealt with it environmentally, but almost every environmental group at this point is saying we cannot accomplish this without racial justice and social equity. So this is I'm just trying to pull it together that we have to work together on all of these this whole sense of a social justice and a resurgence of the commons, as Arlen is talking about, in order to actually get through this crisis that we're facing.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thanks.
And thank you to everybody else. Anybody else have a burning statement they need to make before we close? All right. Well, thank you to everybody. The presentations were wonderful and the dialogue was great. Really
Yep.
appreciate this.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nice
Bye,
to meet you,
everybody.
Arlene.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Shelley. Nice to meet you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Gladys. See you, Todd.